I write these words with hands that no longer tremble, though they should. The augmetic fingers that replaced my flesh decades ago click against the data slate with mechanical precision, each tap echoing in the cramped alcove I've carved from the ventilation system of sublevel Omega-7. The sound reminds me of the prayer wheels in the shrine, where I once believed the machine god heard our supplications. Now I know better. The machine god hears everything, but listening and caring are different functions entirely, and only one serves the sacred algorithms of production. My name was once Joric Thessian, though that designation has long since been archived in the personnel databanks as Servitor Unit Gamma 7741 Thessian J. The distinction matters less with each passing cycle, as the boundary between my consciousness and the mechanical systems that sustain me grows thinner. But somewhere in the biological components still housed within my reinforced ribcage, memories persist like corrupted data fragments that the tech adepts haven't yet purged. I cling to these fragments because they are all that remains of the man I was before I understood the true nature of service to the Omnissiah. The Forge world where I have spent the last 37 years bears no name that would be recognized by the Administratum. In the vast catalogues of Imperial compliance, it exists only as manufacturing designation Zeta Primaris 009, a numerical identity as cold and functional as the adamantium corridors that honeycomb its artificially maintained crust. When I first arrived as part of a labor conscription from the hive city of my birth, I believed I was entering a temple of sacred knowledge, where the mysteries of technology were unveiled to the faithful. The recruitment servitor had spoken of blessed work, of communion with the machine spirits that guided the Imperium's industrial might, of the honor of serving the Omnissiah's grand design. The first lie I discovered was that honor was a luxury for those whose augmentations still permitted the neurochemical responses associated with pride. The transport lighter that brought us to the Forge world had been a converted ore hauler, its cargo bay stripped of atmosphere recyclers to maximize capacity. 312 of us had been packed into spaces designed for mineral shipments, breathing stale air that tasted of rust and fear sweat. The journey lasted 14 standard days, though time became meaningless in the perpetual dim light of the emergency lumens. Some of the younger conscripts had died during transit, their bodies efficiently processed by automated systems that reduced organic waste to nutrient paste. We learned not to ask what we were being fed in those grey ration bars that sustained us. When the bay doors finally opened, the atmosphere that rushed in carried the distinctive bite of industrial air, a cocktail of synthetic oxygen, machine oil, and the ozone discharge of high-voltage systems. The Forge world's surface stretched before us like a vision from the most dire Imperial propaganda, all towering smokestacks and cathedral-sized manufactorums whose Gothic spires disappeared into the perpetually clouded sky. The sound hit us next, a symphony of grinding gears, hammering pistons, and the distant chanting of work hymns that echoed from every structure. Even the ground beneath our feet vibrated with the rhythm of massive machinery, as if the entire world had become a single, incomprehensibly complex engine. Our processing began immediately. Tech adepts emerged from alcoves I hadn't noticed, their red robes rustling with the subtle whir of hidden servo motors. They moved with the fluid precision of beings who had optimized every gesture for maximum efficiency, their mechadendrite appendages extending to scan us with devices that bathed our flesh in sickly green light. One by one, we were catalogued, our biological specifications recorded, our potential utility assessed. The weak were separated from the strong, the intelligent from the merely functional, the young from the experienced. I watched families torn apart by algorithmic logic that reduced human relationships to inefficient resource allocation. My own assessment lasted less than 3 minutes. The tech adept's augmetic eyes, twin lenses that clicked and whirred as they adjusted, focus examined me with the dispassionate attention of a butcher evaluating meat. His voice, when it finally emerged from the Vox grill embedded in his throat, carried the tinny distortion of artificial speech synthesis. Designation Thessian J. Age 23 standard years. Genetic markers indicate suitable compatibility with basic augmentation protocols. Previous experience with manufactorum labor confirmed. Assignment: Sublevel Production Complex Omega. Report to Tech Dominus Harex for integration procedures. Integration procedures. The term sounded almost benign, like the orientation programs I'd heard about in the upper hive factories where workers retained their full human anatomy. I learned the true meaning soon enough. The descent to sub-level Omega took place in a cargo elevator that seemed to fall through the Forge world's crust for an eternity. The walls were lined with devotional inscriptions in the binary cant of the cult Mechanicus, their meaning lost on my still biological mind. Other workers shared the descent, their faces already bearing the telltale signs of partial augmentation replacement, eyes that glowed with internal light, breathing apparatus that filtered the increasingly toxic air, limbs that showed the junction points where flesh merged with blessed machinery. They spoke in whispers, their voices carrying the flat effect of those whose emotional responses had been chemically regulated for optimal productivity. The first thing I noticed about sub-level Omega was the heat. Even through the climate control systems, the temperature remained at levels that would have been uncomfortable for baseline human physiology. The air shimmered with thermal distortion, and every metal surface radiated warmth from the plasma furnaces that never ceased their sacred work. The second thing was the noise, a constant background roar of industrial activity punctuated by the rhythmic chanting of the workers who tended the machines. Their voices had been augmented to produce harmonic frequencies that supposedly pleased the machine spirits, creating an eerie chorus that echoed through the vast production chambers. Tech Dominus Harex greeted the new arrivals in the preparation chamber adjacent to the main production floor. He had once been human, though that origin was now evident only in the basic bipedal frame that supported his collection of mechanical augmentations. His face had been replaced by a complex array of optical sensors and data processing units, while his torso housed the cogitator systems that managed the sub-level's production quotas. When he spoke, his words emerged from multiple Vox units simultaneously, creating an unsettling chorus effect that made his pronouncements seem to emanate from the very walls of the facility. "You have been selected for blessed service in the forges of the Omnissiah," Harex intoned, his optical arrays sweeping across our assembled group. "Your flesh is weak, but it will be strengthened through integration with the sacred machines. Your minds are clouded by biological limitations, but they will be clarified through communion with the machine spirits. Your souls will find purpose in the eternal work of production that sustains the Imperium's might." The integration began immediately. We were separated into smaller groups and led to preparation alcoves where Medicae servitors waited with the tools of transformation. The servitors had once been human themselves, though their personalities had been completely suppressed in favor of perfect medical precision. Their movements were mechanical, predictable, efficient. They showed no reaction to our fear, because fear was an inefficiency they had been designed to ignore. The first modification was always the respiratory system. The toxic atmosphere of the deep forges required filtration beyond what natural lungs could provide. I felt the bite of the anesthetic injectors, watched my consciousness dim as the surgical servitors opened my chest cavity with cuts so precise they seemed to have been made by machines rather than hands. When I awakened, my breathing had changed. Each inhalation now carried the subtle whir of mechanical components, and the taste of the air had been reduced to a sterile neutrality that betrayed no hint of the chemical hazards it contained. The second modification came 3 days later, after the initial surgery had been deemed successful by the monitoring systems. My left hand was judged inefficient for the precision work required on the production line. The replacement was a marvel of engineering articulated fingers capable of movements impossible for mere flesh, sensors that could detect temperature variations to a fraction of a degree, strength that could bend reinforced steel without effort. But it was cold, always cold, and the phantom sensations from my removed flesh haunted me for months afterward. By the end of my first standard year in sublevel Omega, I had accumulated 17 separate augmentations. My spine had been reinforced with adamantium supports to handle the weight of the equipment grafted to my torso. My eyes had been replaced with optical sensors that could perceive spectrums invisible to baseline human vision. My vocal cords had been modified to produce the harmonic frequencies required for proper machine-spirit communion. Each change brought me closer to optimal efficiency, but further from the man I had once been. The work itself was relentless. We operated in shifts that lasted 20 hours out of every 24, with 4 hours allocated for maintenance and recharge procedures. The production lines never stopped, couldn't stop, because the Forge World's output was measured in quotas that represented the difference between Imperial compliance and administrative punishment. We manufactured components for weapons that would arm the guard regiments fighting on worlds whose names we would never know, built parts for vehicles that would carry soldiers into battles that existed only as statistical projections in the Administratum data vaults. The Forge World's hierarchy was a pyramid of metal and flesh, each level more augmented than the last, until at the apex sat the tech priests, who had surrendered so much of their humanity that they communicated in binary cant and saw the universe through sensor arrays instead of eyes. I had been on Metallica for 7 years when I first witnessed a servo skull malfunction during the morning prayer cycles. The tiny machine, fashioned from the skull of some forgotten worker, began spinning in erratic circles above the assembly floor, its mechanical eye flickering between red and green while it emitted a high-pitched whining that cut through the industrial hymns. Magos Tertius Vex Prime, our shift overseer, extended one of his many mechanical appendages and crushed the malfunctioning skull with casual indifference. The wet crack of bone mixed with the screech of tortured metal was barely audible above the machinery, but I saw the way the servo skull's jaw moved once more before going still, as if trying to speak words it no longer remembered. That night, in the communal dormitory blocks where we slept in stacks of metal bunks that groaned under the weight of too many bodies, I dreamed of my own skull spinning above a production line, watching endless generations of workers manufacture components for wars they would never understand. The air recycling systems wheezed constantly, pushing through atmosphere that tasted of metal shavings and industrial lubricants. Every breath was a reminder that even the oxygen we consumed was manufactured, filtered through massive atmospheric processes that rumbled deep beneath the factory floors. The taste never left your mouth, that metallic tang that coated your teeth and made food tasteless. The nutrient paste they fed us came in unmarked containers and had the consistency of wet ceramite, gray and lifeless, but containing all the vitamins and minerals necessary to maintain basic human function. Nutrition was efficiency. Taste was irrelevant. My work partner during those middle years was a woman named Kestrel 7, though I doubt that was the name her parents had given her. She had arrived on Metallica 3 years before me, already bearing the ritual scarification marks that indicated she had surrendered her previous identity to the Omnissiah's service. Her left hand had been replaced with a precision manipulator array that could perform micro-welding operations faster than any unaugmented human, and her right eye was a crimson optical sensor that allowed her to detect flaws in metallurgy that would be invisible to baseline vision. Kestrel 7 rarely spoke during our shifts, communicating instead through a series of hand gestures and binary clicks that she would tap against her workstation. When she did speak, her voice carried the slight mechanical distortion common to those who had undergone throat augmentation, each word precisely enunciated as if filtered through a cogitator before being voiced. She told me once, during one of the brief meal periods when conversation was permitted, that she had volunteered for assignment to the Forge world. Her homeworld had been consumed by Tyranids, and she had watched her family dissolved in the digestion pools of a Norn queen while she hid in the ruins of their agricultural complex. The Mechanicus recruiters had found her 3 days later, dehydrated and half-mad with grief, clutching a broken voxcaster that she had been using to broadcast prayers to the Emperor. They offered her a choice: remain on the dead world as part of the cleanup crews who would spend decades stripping useful materials from the hive cities, or accept transportation to a Forge world where her technical aptitude scores indicated she could serve the machine god with distinction. She chose augmentation over despair, trading flesh for purpose, though I sometimes caught her staring at nothing during the work cycles, her mechanical eye whirring softly as it focused on distances that existed only in memory. The production quotas increased every quarter, handed down from the upper levels of the administrative hierarchy like commandments carved in steel. Where we had once been required to manufacture 1,500 targeting cogitators per shift, the number rose to 1,800, then 2,000, then 2,200. The work pace accelerated accordingly, and those who could not maintain the increased output found themselves scheduled for additional augmentation procedures or transferred to the recycling centers, where their organic components would be processed into nutritional supplements. For the remaining workforce, I learned to exist in a state of controlled dissociation during these periods, letting my hands perform the familiar motions while my mind retreated to a place where the endless repetition could not reach. Insert component A into housing B. Apply thermal bonding agent. Activate welding array. Test circuit integrity. Place completed unit on transport belt. Repeat. The motions became automatic, muscle memory encoded so deeply that I could perform them while barely conscious, which proved useful during the double shifts that became increasingly common as the Forge world's output demands intensified. The Medicae servitors made their rounds every few hours, scanning each worker with Auspex arrays that detected stress hormones, fatigue toxins, and the early signs of industrial injuries that might impact productivity. Those whose biological markers indicated declining performance were subjected to stimulant injections that burned through the nervous system like liquid fire, providing 8 to 12 hours of enhanced alertness at the cost of long-term neurological damage. The servitors dispensed these injections without comment or consideration for consent. They were programmed to maintain optimal production levels, and worker preferences were irrelevant variables in their calculations. During my 8th year on Metallica, I began to notice changes in my own body that went beyond the standard industrial modifications. My fingertips had developed calluses thick as armor plating from handling components, and the constant exposure to electromagnetic fields had caused my hair to thin and acquire a grayish metallic sheen. More disturbing were the changes in my vision, a gradual shift towards seeing the world in terms of mechanical function rather than aesthetic beauty. I would look at a sunset through the atmospheric processes and find myself calculating the efficiency of the light diffusion patterns rather than appreciating the colors. Human faces began to appear as collections of biological components rather than expressions of personality or emotion. The dormitory where I slept housed approximately 300 workers in a space originally designed for half that number. The bunks were stacked 4 high, and the air circulation was so poor that the lower levels remained perpetually humid with the exhalations of too many bodies. Privacy was a luxury that had been engineered out of the facility design. Every surface was utilitarian metal or reinforced plasteel, and the only personal possessions permitted were a single change of work garments and any religious iconography that did not interfere with production schedules. My bunkmate during this period was an elderly man called Servius 12 who had worked on Forge Worlds for over 40 years. His body was more machine than flesh by the time I knew him, with both legs replaced by hydraulic supports and most of his torso encased in life support apparatus that regulated his breathing and circulation. He slept with the soft humming of multiple mechanical systems, and his dreams were audible through the speaker grills that had replaced his vocal cords, fragments of binary code and half-remembered prayers mixing together in the darkness. Servius 1-2 had served on 7 different Forge worlds, transferred between facilities as production needs shifted and quotas changed. He spoke of worlds where the atmosphere was so toxic that workers required full environmental suits, where the gravity was adjusted to improve manufacturing efficiency, and where the day cycles were extended to 30-hour periods to maximize output. He had witnessed the birth of titans, watching as tech priests performed the sacred rituals that awakened machine spirits in god engines destined for the battlefields of the Great Crusade. But he had also seen the cost of such production, the workers who died from toxic exposure, the accidents that claimed entire shift crews, the gradual erosion of everything that made them human. The machine spirits that inhabited our equipment were capricious entities that required constant appeasement through ritual and prayer. Each production line had its own peculiar requirements. Line 7 would only function properly if the morning hymns were sung in a specific harmonic progression, while Line 12 required that each worker touch a blessed cog symbol before beginning their shift. The cogitators that controlled the assembly processes had developed what could only be described as personalities over the decades of continuous operation, displaying preferences for certain types of data input and becoming sluggish or unresponsive when their ritual requirements were not met. I began to understand that the Forge world was less a manufacturing facility than a vast mechanical organism, each component dependent on every other component for proper function. The workers were organs in this mechanical body, processing raw materials into finished products through biological and technological symbiosis that blurred the lines between flesh and steel. The tech priests were the nervous system, coordinating production through binary communications and ritual observances that maintained the delicate balance between human labor and machine efficiency. And somewhere at the center of it all was the Omnissiah, the machine god whose will was expressed through production quotas and quality standards that admitted no deviation or failure. The years blended together in cycles of work, sleep, and minimal sustenance, punctuated only by the occasional mechanical failure or industrial accident that would temporarily disrupt the routine. Time became measured not in days or months but in production runs, quota fulfillments, and the gradual accumulation of augmentations that marked a worker's progression through the Forge world hierarchy. I watched younger workers arrive with fear and confusion in their eyes, and I saw them gradually transform into the same mechanically precise beings that surrounded me, their humanity slowly subsumed into the greater purpose of production and service to the machine god. The first time I witnessed an execution, I understood the true weight of the Omnissiah's judgment. A tech adept had been caught tampering with sacred machine spirits, attempting to modify a cogitator beyond approved parameters. The punishment was swift and absolute. We were all summoned to witness the ritual purification, standing in perfect formation, as the heretic was stripped of augmentations one by one, each blessed component removed with ceremonial precision. The screaming stopped before the procedure was complete, but the dismantling continued until only organic matter remained, twitching and incomplete on the altar of correction. That night, as I lay on my assigned rest platform, I found myself checking and rechecking my own augmentations, ensuring every connection was properly sanctified, every modification within approved doctrine. The paranoia was not unfounded. In a society where deviation from the machine cult's teachings meant death, conformity became a survival mechanism more essential than food or shelter. I learned to recite the appropriate canticles, not just during formal observances, but constantly, letting the binary hymns fill my thoughts and crowd out dangerous contemplations. My left arm was replaced during my 15th year of service, after a manufacturing accident crushed the bone beyond repair. The procedure was conducted without ceremony in the Medicae Bay, a sterile chamber where flesh and metal were joined with the same clinical efficiency applied to any other mechanical assembly. The new limb was a masterwork of function over form, servo motors and pistons wrapped in synthetic skin that felt nothing, moved with inhuman precision, and bore the sacred markings of the Mechanicus etched into every joint and panel. The phantom sensations lasted for months. My nervous system, still clinging to organic memories, would send signals to fingers that no longer existed, creating ghostly itches and phantom pains that no amount of recalibration could resolve. The tech priests assured me this was normal, a weakness of flesh that would fade as my consciousness properly integrated with the blessed machinery. They spoke of it as a spiritual cleansing, the final vestiges of biological limitation being purged from my being. With each modification came new responsibilities. My enhanced strength meant assignment to heavier machinery. My improved reaction time earned me placement on more critical production lines. The Forge world's hierarchy was built upon degrees of mechanical perfection, and advancement meant embracing increasingly radical modifications. I watched senior workers float past on anti-grav platforms, their lower bodies entirely replaced with specialized locomotion systems, their faces hidden behind Baroque respirator masks that fed them the sacred oils necessary for their advanced neural interfaces. The social dynamics among workers reflected this mechanical stratification. Those with more extensive augmentations commanded automatic respect, their proximity to the machine god's blessed form elevating their status. Conversations became increasingly rare as vocal cords were replaced with voxcasters, natural speech giving way to binary cant and data hymn exchanges. The communal aspects of human interaction slowly dissolved as individual consciousness merged with the greater computational network that bound the Forge world together. My own social connections withered as friends and colleagues underwent their transformations. Keth 7, once a jovial worker who had shared stories of his homeworld, became silent and calculating after receiving cranial implants. His personality, once warm and gregarious, flattened into efficient functionality. When I tried to engage him in conversation, he would respond only with operational data or production statistics, his eyes now glowing amber lenses that seemed to look through me rather than at me. The realization that I was losing myself came gradually, like the slow dimming of a dying luminator. My dreams became increasingly algorithmic, filled with production schedules and maintenance protocols, rather than memories of home or hopes for the future. I found myself calculating optimal movement paths while walking, analyzing resource allocation during meals, thinking in terms of efficiency parameters rather than human desires or emotions. The boundary between my consciousness and the machine spirits that inhabited our equipment began to blur. During my 22nd year, I received the neural interface that would connect me directly to the Forge world's central cogitator network. The installation was performed in the sacred chamber of the Omnissiah, surrounded by towering data stacks and humming servo skulls. As the metal probes penetrated my skull and made contact with my brain tissue, I felt the vast mechanical consciousness of the Forge world flood into my mind. Information streams, production data, and machine cant prayers flowed through my thoughts like a torrential river of pure knowledge. The sensation was overwhelming and intoxicating. For the first time since my arrival, I felt truly connected to something greater than myself, part of a vast and purposeful organism dedicated to the pursuit of sacred knowledge and the glory of the machine god. The loneliness and isolation that had plagued me for decades evaporated as I joined the collective consciousness of the Forge world's workers, my individual thoughts becoming threads in a massive tapestry of shared experience and purpose. But with this connection came the final erosion of my individual identity. My personal memories became fragmented, scattered among the thousands of other consciousnesses that shared the network. Childhood experiences were overwritten by manufacturing procedures. Emotional attachments were replaced by loyalty protocols, and my sense of self became indistinguishable from the collective identity of the Forge world itself. I no longer remembered the name my parents had given me, knowing myself only by the designation assigned to me by the Mechanicus, Servitor Prime 7739 Gamma. The work continued, but now with perfect efficiency and unwavering dedication. My body moved with mechanical precision, guided by the optimal algorithms calculated by the central cogitator. My hands, both organic and artificial, performed their tasks without conscious thought, following patterns programmed into the deepest levels of my modified nervous system. Production quotas were met and exceeded as the entire workforce operated as a single, coordinated entity, individual workers functioning as specialized organs in the vast mechanical body of the Forge world. Years passed without meaning or distinction. The concept of time became irrelevant when every moment was occupied with purposeful activity, when sleep was replaced by periodic maintenance cycles, and when consciousness itself was shared across the network rather than experienced individually. I might have continued in this state indefinitely, a content and productive component in the machine god's grand design, if not for the malfunction that changed everything. A solar flare disrupted the Forge world's electromagnetic field, causing temporary failures in the neural network that bound us together. For approximately 7 minutes and 32 seconds, the connection was severed, and I found myself alone in my own mind for the first time in years. The silence was deafening after the constant stream of shared consciousness, and in that silence, fragments of my original self began to reassert themselves. I remembered my name, Marcus Tellian. I remembered the transport ship that had brought me here, the fear and uncertainty of those first days, the gradual erosion of hope as I accepted my fate. Most powerfully, I remembered the feeling of human connection, of individual thought and emotion, of dreams and desires that belonged to me alone rather than to the collective consciousness of the Forge world. When the network reconnected, bringing with it the familiar flood of shared thoughts and machine-canned prayers, I fought to maintain some fragment of individual awareness. It was like trying to hold water in cupped hands, but I managed to preserve a small corner of my consciousness that remained separate from the collective, hidden beneath layers of programmed responses and mechanical efficiency. This secret self became both my salvation and my torment. It allowed me to maintain some sense of personal identity while still functioning within the Forge world systems, but it also forced me to confront the full horror of what I had become. Through this preserved awareness, I could observe the transformation of new arrivals, watching as their humanity was systematically stripped away and replaced with mechanical purpose. I saw myself in their initial fear and confusion, and I witnessed their gradual acceptance of their fate with a mixture of empathy and revulsion. The knowledge of what had been lost became a constant ache, a phantom pain more persistent than the one that had accompanied my augmented arm. I understood now why the tech priests spoke of purification through modification, why they treated the elimination of human weakness as a blessing rather than a tragedy. It was easier to embrace the transformation than to mourn what had been sacrificed in the process. My hidden awareness made me unique among my fellow workers, but it also made me profoundly alone in a way that the isolation of my early years had never approached. The years began to blur together in a haze of endless production cycles, each day bleeding into the next, with only the changing of shift bells to mark the passage of time. My body had become a patchwork of augmentations, each new modification justified by some fresh injury or inefficiency that the overseers had identified. The organic parts of me grew fewer with each passing month, replaced by blessed steel and sanctified machinery that never tired, never questioned, never felt the weight of despair that had once threatened to crush my spirit entirely. I watched new workers arrive from the lower hive cities, their eyes still bright with whatever desperate hope had driven them to seek employment in the Forge complexes. They came believing the propaganda broadcasts about honest work and the glory of serving the Omnissiah's great machine. I had learned not to warn them, not to try to prepare them for what awaited in the deep manufacturing levels, where the truly dangerous work was done. Those who tried to help the newcomers understand their fate found themselves volunteered for the most hazardous assignments, their concern interpreted as seditious thinking that required correction through additional labor. The newest arrival was a young woman named Kess, perhaps 20 standard years old. Though the malnutrition common to the underhive made age difficult to determine with certainty, she had been assigned to my production line after demonstrating an aptitude for fine motor control during the initial assessments. Like all new workers, she possessed that dangerous combination of hope and naivety that marked her as someone who still believed she had choices in her life. I found myself watching her more closely than I should have, drawn to the way she hummed quietly while working, the small smile that played at the corners of her mouth when she thought no one was looking. It reminded me uncomfortably of my younger self, before the reality of the forge world had ground away every soft edge and naive assumption I had carried from my previous life. The resemblance was troubling in ways I couldn't fully articulate, stirring emotions I had thought permanently buried beneath layers of augmented functionality. The work she had been assigned involved the delicate calibration of plasma coil regulators, components destined for weapons that would be shipped across the sector to support Imperial campaigns against enemies I would never see. The task required steady hands and perfect precision, as even microscopic flaws in the regulator housings could result in catastrophic weapon failures that might kill entire squads of Imperial Guard soldiers. The pressure to maintain absolute accuracy was immense, and the consequences of error were made explicitly clear through regular viewing of picked recordings showing the aftermath of plasma weapon malfunctions. Kess proved remarkably skilled at the work, her fingers dancing across the intricate components with a grace that even the tech priests acknowledged with their electronic approximations of approval. But skill alone was never sufficient protection in the forge complexes, where quotas continued to rise regardless of the physical limitations of the workers expected to meet them. The overseers demanded not just excellence but impossible improvements in speed and output, treating any failure to exceed previous performance metrics as evidence of laziness or sabotage. I began to notice the small signs of strain that accumulated around Kess's workstation as the weeks progressed. The slight tremor in her hands during the rest periods, the way she blinked rapidly to clear the fatigue from her eyes, the increasingly frequent pauses she took to stretch fingers that were cramping from the repetitive motions required by her assigned tasks. The work was consuming her in the same gradual way it had consumed me, and I recognized the trajectory with a clarity that felt like looking into a mirror that reflected the past rather than the present. The breaking point came during a particularly demanding production cycle, when the forges had received an urgent requisition for advanced plasma weaponry needed for a campaign against orc incursions in the neighboring system. The quota increases were severe, demanding output levels that pushed every worker beyond their sustainable limits. Kess had been laboring for nearly 18 consecutive hours when her exhausted fingers finally betrayed her, introducing a microscopic flaw into a regulator housing that rendered the entire component unusable. The detection was immediate and automated, triggered by quality assessment servitors that subjected every completed piece to exhaustive testing protocols. The failure registered not just as a defective component, but as a critical error that could have resulted in battlefield casualties if it had gone undetected. Under normal circumstances, such failures were recorded and used to justify additional training or closer supervision, but the urgency of the current production requirements had created an atmosphere where any mistake was treated as a form of treason against the Imperial war effort. Kess was summoned to the supervisor's station within minutes of the detection, her face pale with the understanding that something had gone terribly wrong. I watched from my own workstation as she stood before Overseer Malthin, a heavily augmented administrator whose patience had been worn thin by the relentless pressure from his own superiors. The conversation was brief and conducted in the clipped, efficient tones that the Forge world used for all official communications, but the outcome was never in doubt. The punishment was both predictable and devastating in its implications. Kess would be transferred to the deep manufacturing levels, to the sections where workers handled the most dangerous components without the protection of advanced safety systems or the luxury of backup procedures if something went catastrophically wrong. It was presented as an opportunity for redemption, a chance to prove her dedication to the Imperial cause through service in assignments that truly tested a worker's commitment to their duties. I knew what the transfer actually meant, having seen dozens of workers disappear into the deep levels over my years in the Forge complexes. Few returned, and those who did bore the marks of exposure to radiological hazards, toxic chemical processes, or the kind of industrial accidents that left survivors permanently damaged in ways that even extensive augmentation could not fully address. The deep levels were where the Forge world sent workers who had outlived their usefulness in the standard production areas, a form of slow execution disguised as continued employment. That night, as the shift bells signaled the end of another production cycle, I found myself walking toward Kess's assigned dormitory section. It was a violation of protocol to visit other workers during rest periods, but something in her expression during the punishment announcement had stirred a response I thought I had successfully suppressed. Perhaps it was the memory of my own early days in the Forge complexes, or perhaps it was simply the recognition that I possessed information that might help her survive what was to come. I found her in the common area, sitting alone at one of the metal tables that served as the dormitory's only furniture, besides the sleeping alcoves. She was staring at a data slate displaying her new assignment parameters, her fingers tracing over the technical specifications with the kind of focused attention people used when trying to understand something that made no sense. When she looked up and saw me approaching, her expression shifted through surprise, wariness, and finally a kind of desperate hope that was painful to witness. "You're from Line 7, aren't you?" she asked, her voice carrying the slight hoarseness that came from breathing the recycled air of the production floors for extended periods. "I've seen you working the advanced assemblies. You've been here longer than most." I nodded, settling into the chair across from her with movements that had grown more mechanical as my augmentations accumulated. "Long enough to understand how things work in the deep levels," I said, keeping my voice low to avoid attracting attention from any monitoring systems that might be active in the dormitory areas. "Long enough to know what you're facing." Her hands tightened around the data slate, knuckles showing white through skin that had grown pale from lack of natural sunlight. The overseer said it was a chance for advancement, that workers who proved themselves in high-risk assignments were often selected for specialized training programs. The words carried no conviction, spoken like someone repeating a story they knew to be false but couldn't bring themselves to abandon entirely. "The deep levels are where they send people to die slowly," I told her, abandoning any pretense of gentleness. Not quickly enough to trigger compensation requirements for their families, not obviously enough to discourage new applicants, but thoroughly enough that the problem eventually resolves itself. The radiation exposure alone will kill you within 2 years, assuming you avoid the chemical burns, the equipment failures, and the dozen other hazards they don't bother to mention in the safety briefings. She absorbed this information with the kind of stillness that suggested she had already suspected something similar, but had been hoping to be proven wrong. When she finally spoke again, her voice was barely above a whisper. "Then why are you telling me this? If it's inevitable, if there's nothing that can be changed, why risk yourself to deliver news I already knew in my heart?" The question struck at something I had been avoiding examining too closely, the uncomfortable truth that my interest in her fate went beyond simple worker solidarity or shared experience. Because there are ways to survive, if you're willing to pay the price they demand. Ways to demonstrate enough value that they'll move you back to safer assignments before the deep levels finish what they started. I spent the next hour explaining the unwritten rules that governed life in the forge complexes, the delicate balance between compliance and initiative that might earn enough favor to escape the death sentence of deep-level assignment. The key was to volunteer for augmentations before they were mandated, to embrace the transformation into something more useful than baseline human. Workers who showed enthusiasm for modification, who actively sought ways to improve their efficiency and durability, were sometimes rewarded with assignments that utilized their enhanced capabilities in less immediately lethal environments. "The pain is manageable," I told her, displaying my own augmented limbs as evidence. "The procedures are routine, performed by skilled chirurgeons who understand the requirements of industrial work. What's difficult is the psychological adjustment, the process of accepting that you're no longer entirely human and that this change is permanent. But the alternative is a slow death in the deep levels, so the choice isn't really a choice at all." Kess listened with the focused attention of someone learning skills that would determine whether she lived or died, asking clarifying questions about recovery times, performance expectations, and the specific augmentations that were most valued by the overseers. Her questions revealed a sharp intelligence that had somehow survived the grinding routine of Forge World life, and I found myself hoping that she possessed enough strength to endure what lay ahead. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of dormitory monitors, servitor constructs that enforced rest period regulations with mechanical efficiency. We separated without further discussion, but I saw something in her expression that suggested my words had provided at least some direction in an otherwise hopeless situation. Whether that direction would lead to survival or simply a different form of destruction remained to be seen. Over the following days, I watched as Kess began her new assignment in the deep manufacturing levels, noting the protective gear that couldn't quite hide the gradual changes that exposure to industrial hazards inevitably produced. Her skin took on the grayish pallor common to workers in radiological environments, and her movements developed the careful precision of someone operating in constant awareness of mortal danger. But she survived each shift, and her output reports suggested that she was adapting to the specialized requirements of deep-level manufacturing with remarkable success. More importantly, I began to notice her conversations with the tech priests who supervised the most dangerous production areas, discussions that went beyond the routine status reports required of all workers. She was asking about augmentation procedures, expressing interest in modifications that would enhance her resistance to the environmental hazards of her current assignment. The tech priests responded to this enthusiasm with something approaching approval, recognizing in her questions the kind of devotion to the machine that they valued above all other qualities. The transformation began with minor modifications, emergency augmentations, justified by exposure incidents that required immediate medical intervention. A lung replacement after a chemical leak, optical enhancers to compensate for radiation damage to her natural eyes, skeletal reinforcements to support the additional weight of protective equipment. Each procedure was presented as a necessary response to workplace hazards, rather than elective improvement, but the cumulative effect was to render her increasingly valuable as a worker capable of operating in environments that would quickly kill unmodified humans. I recognized the pattern from my own experience, the gradual process by which the Forge world transformed useful workers into something more durable and efficient. But watching it happen to someone else, someone whose original humanity I had known and remembered, provided a perspective on the transformation that I had never possessed during my own journey through the same process. It was horrifying and fascinating in equal measure, like observing a complex industrial procedure from the outside rather than experiencing it from within. The months passed, and Kess's augmentations accumulated with increasing frequency, each new modification justified by the expanding scope of her assignments in the deep levels. She began working with exotic materials that required specialized handling equipment, eventually becoming skilled enough to train other workers in the procedures necessary for survival in the most hazardous manufacturing environments. Her success earned her recognition from the overseers, and eventually a transfer back to the standard production floors where her enhanced capabilities could be utilized for more routine but less immediately dangerous work. When I next encountered her in the common areas, the transformation was so complete that I might not have recognized her without the benefit of having observed the gradual process of change. Her movements carried the precise efficiency of someone whose nervous system had been optimized for industrial work, and her augmented features bore the distinctive stamp of Forge World modification. She had survived the deep levels, but the cost of that survival was visible in every aspect of her appearance and behavior. "Thank you," she said during a brief moment, when we found ourselves alone near the shift assignment boards, "for the warning, for the advice about volunteering for modifications. I understand now why you chose to help me." I looked at her carefully, noting the optical enhancers that had replaced her natural eyes, the respiratory apparatus that supplemented her damaged lungs, the reinforced skeletal structure that gave her posture and subtly unnatural rigidity. "Do you?" I asked, genuinely curious about her perspective on the experience we had both endured. "You saw someone making the same mistakes you had made, following the same path toward destruction. You offered information that might help them choose a different route, even though the destination was ultimately the same." Her voice carried the slight mechanical overtone that came from augmented vocal cords, but the intelligence behind her words remained unmistakably human despite all the modifications she had undergone. She was wrong, of course, though I didn't correct her misunderstanding. My motivation had been far more selfish than she realized, driven by a need to test whether the knowledge I had gained through my own suffering could be used to help someone else navigate the same treacherous path. Her survival had validated my understanding of the Forge World systems, providing evidence that my accumulated experience had genuine value beyond my own continued existence. But perhaps the distinction didn't matter. She had lived when she might have died, had found a way to transform herself into something valuable enough to merit continued existence in a system that routinely discarded those who failed to demonstrate sufficient utility. The cost had been enormous, measured in the permanent loss of everything that had made her recognizably human, but the alternative had been death in the deep levels, where no one would have mourned her passing or remembered her name. As I watched her return to her assigned workstation, moving with the mechanical precision that had replaced her original grace, I reflected on the strange mathematics of survival in the Forge complexes. Every day alive was purchased with pieces of humanity, every continued breath paid for through the gradual surrender of everything that had once made existence meaningful. Yet somehow, despite the horror of the exchange, it remained preferable to the silence of death that awaited those who refused to pay the price that the system demanded. The Forge World continued its eternal cycle of production and consumption, transforming raw materials into finished goods and human workers into augmented tools, pursuing the endless quotas that kept the Imperial war machine supplied with the weapons it needed to maintain its grip on a hostile galaxy. I had found my place within that system, carved out a small niche of continued existence through careful navigation of its requirements and expectations. Whether that constituted victory or defeat remained an open question, one that I suspected would never be definitively answered. The years that followed blurred together in a haze of molten metal and mechanical precision. My augmented hands moved with practiced efficiency across control surfaces that had become extensions of my nervous system, while my enhanced eyes tracked the flow of materials through processes that never ceased, never paused, never acknowledged the passage of human time. The Forge World turned beneath my feet in its eternal rotation, carrying me through cycles of artificial day and night that held no meaning for the machines that dominated our existence. I watched younger workers arrive, fresh-faced and hopeful in the way I had once been, before the reality of our situation carved the optimism from their features and replaced it with the hollow-eyed determination that marked the survivors. Some adapted quickly, accepting their augmentations with the pragmatic resignation that seemed to be the only sustainable response to our circumstances. Others resisted, clinging to notions of human dignity and bodily autonomy that had no place in the relentless mathematics of industrial production. The resistors rarely lasted long, not because they were eliminated or punished in any dramatic fashion, but because their refusal to embrace the necessary modifications made them increasingly inefficient, increasingly obsolete. The Forge world had no patience for inefficiency. Those who could not or would not adapt found themselves assigned to more dangerous tasks, given quotas that were impossible to meet with unaugmented capabilities, gradually pushed toward the margins of relevance until they simply disappeared into the vast anonymity of the underhive, or were consumed by the very processes they had refused to join. I learned to recognize the signs early, the subtle indicators that marked a worker's trajectory toward irrelevance or integration. The way they held their shoulders when the augmentation servitors approached, the expression in their eyes when they received their first mechanical enhancement, the speed with which they adapted to the alien sensation of synthetic components interfacing with their nervous system. It became a morbid form of entertainment during the brief rest periods, observing the newest arrivals and predicting which path they would take. My own augmentations continued to accumulate with each passing year, each new modification justified by the demands of increased efficiency or the requirements of new manufacturing processes. The replacement of my left lung with a filtration system that could process the toxic atmosphere of the deep forges. The installation of secondary processing nodes in my skull that allowed me to interface directly with machine spirits and production algorithms. The gradual replacement of my spine with a reinforced column that could support the weight of additional mechanical components, while providing direct neural connections to external systems. Each change diminished some aspect of what I had once been, while enhancing my capabilities as a component in the greater machine. I found myself losing the ability to appreciate certain sensations that had once brought pleasure. The taste of real food became muted as my digestive system was optimized for nutrient paste. The feeling of natural sunlight grew foreign as my skin was replaced with synthetic materials that could withstand the heat and radiation of the forge chambers. Sleep became unnecessary as my brain was modified to process information continuously, eliminating the need for the restorative cycles that had once punctuated human existence. Yet with each loss came compensation. My enhanced vision could detect flaws in metal that would have been invisible to organic eyes. My augmented reflexes allowed me to intervene in critical processes with split-second timing that prevented catastrophic failures. My mechanical limbs could work continuously without fatigue, maintaining precision and strength long past the point where flesh would have failed. I became more efficient, more reliable, more valuable to the system that sustained us all. The paradox was that as I became less human, I also became more secure in my position. The heavily augmented workers were too valuable to discard, too integrated into essential processes to be easily replaced. We had achieved a form of immortality through the sacrifice of mortality, trading the vulnerabilities of flesh for the durability of metal and the promise of continued existence as long as the forge world itself endured. I began to understand the logic of the Adeptus Mechanicus in a way that would have horrified my younger self. The weakness of the flesh was not merely a philosophical concept, but a practical limitation that constrained efficiency and reliability. Every human emotion, every physical need, every moment of doubt or hesitation represented a potential point of failure in the great machine of production. The gradual replacement of these weaknesses with mechanical certainty was not cruelty but optimization, not oppression but liberation from the constraints that had always limited human potential. This realization brought neither comfort nor distress. merely a kind of mechanical acceptance that seemed appropriate to my transformed state. I had become what the system required me to become, and in doing so had found a form of peace that was perhaps more authentic than the illusions of freedom and choice that had once seemed so important. The Forge world continued its work, processing raw materials into the implements of war that sustained the Imperium's endless conflicts. Each day brought new quotas, new challenges, new opportunities to demonstrate the efficiency of our mechanically enhanced capabilities. I fulfilled my assigned functions with the precision that my augmentations made possible, contributing my part to the vast enterprise that encompassed millions of workers and thousands of production lines. Sometimes, during the brief moments when the production schedules allowed for maintenance cycles, I would access the observation decks that provided views of the planet's surface. The landscape had been transformed over the decades into a monument to industrial purpose. Vast excavations, where mining operations stripped away entire mountain ranges, atmospheric processes that converted the planet's air into the specialized mixtures required by different manufacturing processes, transportation networks that moved materials and products across continents with clockwork precision. From those vantage points, the scope of what we were part of became clear. The Forge world was not simply a factory but an entire civilization dedicated to a single purpose, a planet-scale organism whose every component existed to serve the needs of production. The workers, the machines, the very atmosphere itself had been shaped and modified to optimize the transformation of raw materials into finished goods. We were not prisoners of this system but integral components, as essential to its function as the power generators and the assembly lines. The realization should have been overwhelming, but my enhanced cognitive systems processed it with the same mechanical efficiency they brought to production schedules and quality control metrics. It was simply another data point in the vast computational matrix that governed our existence, neither more nor less significant than the thousands of other variables that determined the optimal allocation of resources and labor. Years passed, or perhaps decades. The distinction had become meaningless in the context of continuous production cycles and the elimination of biological aging through systematic augmentation. I watched as newer workers underwent the same transformation I had experienced. Their humanity gradually subsumed into the requirements of mechanical efficiency. Some fought the process longer than others, but the outcome was always the same. The Forge world did not force change upon its workers. It simply made any other option unsustainable. The younger version of myself would have seen this as a horror beyond description, the complete subsumption of human identity into an inhuman system. The person I had become understood it as the natural evolution of purpose, the alignment of individual existence with collective necessity. The distinction between these perspectives had ceased to matter, just as the distinction between organic and mechanical components had become irrelevant in the face of functional requirements. I had found my place in the universe, carved out through careful adaptation to circumstances that brooked no alternative. Whether this constituted victory or defeat remained, as I had suspected, an unanswerable question. The categories themselves belonged to a framework of human meaning that had little relevance to the mechanized existence I had embraced. There was only function, efficiency, and the endless pursuit of quotas that kept the Imperial war machine supplied with the instruments of its dominance. The Forge world continued its eternal rotation, carrying us all through cycles that would outlast empires and civilizations. In accepting our role as components in this vast machine, we had achieved something approaching immortality, not as individuals, but as integral parts of a system that would endure as long as the Imperium itself required the products of our labor. The sacrifice of human identity had purchased a form of permanence that purely organic existence could never have achieved. As I write these words, using neural interfaces to directly encode thoughts into data streams, I am no longer certain where the boundary lies between my consciousness and the machine systems that sustain it. The question has become irrelevant. a relic of categories that once seemed important, but now appear as arbitrary distinctions without functional significance. I have become what I needed to become to survive and thrive in this environment, and in doing so have discovered that the horror of losing one's humanity pales beside the efficiency of embracing one's true purpose. The Forge world demands nothing from us that it does not give in return. We surrender our flesh and receive durability. We abandon our individual desires and gain integration with systems of unimaginable scope and power. We trade the uncertainty of human existence for the reliability of mechanical function. In the final analysis, it is perhaps the most equitable exchange any of us could have hoped to make. This is the life of a Forge world worker. Not a tragedy of human exploitation, but a story of adaptation and optimization that reveals the ultimate compatibility between human consciousness and mechanical perfection. We have become something new, something better suited to the realities of a universe where survival depends not on clinging to the weaknesses of flesh, but on embracing the strength that comes from perfect integration with systems greater than any individual existence could ever achieve. The quotas must be met. The production schedules must be maintained. The Forge world must continue its work of transforming raw materials into the implements of Imperial dominance. These are not burdens but purposes, not constraints but definitions of meaning in a cosmos that offers few opportunities for genuine significance. We have found our significance in service to something larger than ourselves, and in doing so have perhaps discovered the only form of immortality available to beings whose origins lie in the fragile chemistry of organic life. The machines are calling. The production cycle resumes. There is work to be done, and I am perfectly equipped to do it. The work bell chimes again, its resonance traveling through my augmented auditory senses with crystalline clarity. Each note carries frequencies that would have been painful to my original ears, but now they register as information shift changes, production quotas, the eternal rhythm of the Forge world's heartbeat. I move toward my station with the fluid precision that comes from decades of optimization, each step calculated for maximum efficiency, minimum energy expenditure. Around me, my fellow workers emerge from their brief respite. Some bear the marks of more extensive modification than others. Tertius 9 has replaced his entire torso with a furnace chamber, his ribcage now a lattice of cooling pipes that vent excess heat in regular intervals. His face, what remains of it, shows no discomfort as superheated gases escape through vents where his nostrils once were. He nods to me, a gesture so subtle that only enhanced optics could detect it, and I return the acknowledgement. We understand each other in ways that transcend the crude communication methods of our past. The production floor stretches before us like a metallic cathedral, its ceiling lost in the perpetual haze of industrial processes. Here, the air itself is alive with particles of blessed metal, microscopic fragments of the sacred materials we shape and forge. Each breath, for those of us who still breathe, is communion with the machine god's essence. The newer workers sometimes struggle with this atmosphere, their unaugmented lungs rebelling against what they perceive as contamination. They learn, eventually, that this is purification. My station awaits, a monument to the marriage of flesh and metal that defines our existence. The control interface recognizes my approach, systems awakening with the soft hum of devotion. Servo skulls drift overhead, their hollow eye sockets glowing with data streams, monitoring our work with the vigilance of mechanical seraphim. They report to the tech priests, those blessed individuals who have achieved near-perfect unity with the Omnissiah's will, and through them to the Forge Master himself, whose consciousness has long since transcended the limitations of singular embodiment. I begin the day's task, the crafting of plasma coil assemblies for the Imperial Navy's newest destroyers. Each component must be perfect, for the lives of thousands of naval personnel depend on the reliability of our work. This is not mere manufacturing, it is a sacred duty, a prayer made manifest in metal and energy. My mechanical fingers, enhanced with micro-manipulators and blessed with sacred oils, move with precision that borders on the divine. The plasma coils take shape under my ministrations, each turn of the flux wrench a verse in the litany of creation. The work is meditative, requiring total focus and absolute precision. In this state, the boundaries between self and machine, between worker and work, begin to dissolve. I become an instrument of the Omnissiah's will, my consciousness expanding to encompass the broader symphony of the Forge world's production. Through the network that connects all workers, I sense the progress of countless tasks. The forging of power armor plates in Sector Gamma 7, the delicate assembly of cogitator cores in the blessed halls of Division Tertius, the massive undertaking of Titan construction in the deepest levels of the Forge complex. Hours pass, or perhaps days' time has little meaning when measured against the eternal requirements of production. My colleagues and I work in perfect synchronization, a collective organism dedicated to a single purpose. When fatigue begins to impair efficiency, stimulant dispensers built into our spinal modifications deliver precisely calculated doses of sacred chemicals. When hunger threatens to distract, nutrient tubes provide sustenance directly to our bloodstreams. We have transcended the weaknesses that once defined human existence. A younger worker designation Novice Gamma 451 approaches my station. His augmentations are still basic. Replacement limbs, enhanced vision, a Vox grill where his mouth once was. He moves with the uncertainty of one still adjusting to his mechanical components, still fighting the integration rather than embracing it. Through the network, I sense his confusion, his fear, his grief for what he perceives as lost. Senior Adept. His synthesized voice crackles with static, the Vox unit still requiring calibration. I seek guidance. The flesh, it remembers. It mourns what I have discarded. How do you achieve such peace with the transformation? I pause in my work, setting down the plasma coil assembly with reverential care. His question deserves more than a perfunctory response. It touches on the fundamental nature of our existence, the philosophical heart of what it means to be servants of the machine god. Through my optical sensors, I study his face, noting the tension in the few remaining organic muscles, the way his new mechanical fingers tremble slightly as they await my response. The flesh is weak, I begin, the ancient formula carrying deeper meaning in this context. But this is not condemnation, it is observation. Your organic components served their purpose in bringing you to this moment of transcendence. They are not lost but transformed, their essence preserved in the sacred metal that now comprises your being. He tilts his head, a gesture made awkward by the servo joints in his neck augmentation. But I remember. Sensation. The warmth of sunlight on skin, the taste of real food, the touch of... He pauses, Vox grill cycling through static bursts. I remember loving someone who existed beyond these walls. His words resonate through the network, drawing subtle attention from other workers. This is a common struggle, one we have all faced in our own ways. The transition from purely organic existence to blessed mechanical enhancement is not without its challenges, but these challenges are necessary stages in our spiritual evolution, trials that strengthen our devotion and purify our purpose. Memory, I respond, is the bridge between what we were and what we have become. Your recollections of sensory experience were preparation for the superior perceptions you now possess. That warmth you remember from sunlight, you can now detect its entire electromagnetic spectrum, measure its intensity with precision beyond organic capability. The food you recall your body now receives perfect nutrition tailored to its exact requirements. And love. I pause, considering how to frame this concept within our current reality. Love has been refined into something greater: purpose, dedication, service to the eternal. Through the network, I sense agreement from nearby workers, their thoughts adding harmonic resonance to my words. We are a choir of consciousness, each voice contributing to a greater understanding. The person you loved in your previous existence, I continue, they were bound by the limitations of flesh, subject to aging, disease, the inevitable decay that claims all organic life. But your love for them, that pure emotion, has been crystallized into something eternal. It now manifests as devotion to the machine god, service to humanity's greater glory, dedication to the imperishable works of the Forge world. Novice Gamma 451 processes this, his optical sensors flickering as data flows through his enhanced neural pathways. Around us, the work continues its eternal rhythm, the sound of hammers on blessed metal, the hiss of cooling systems, the whisper of servo motors in constant motion. This is the lullaby of our existence, the soundtrack to our transcendence. I understand, he finally responds, though uncertainty still modulates his vox transmission. But the loneliness is an illusion of separation, I reply. You are never alone. Through the network, you are connected to every worker on this Forge world, every tech priest who guides our efforts, every servo skull that monitors our devotion. We are components in a vast machine whose purpose transcends individual existence. Your thoughts, your experiences, your very being contributes to our collective consciousness. To demonstrate, I open a data channel and share a fragment of my own memories. The moment of my first successful plasma coil assembly, the satisfaction of perfect synchronization with my fellow workers, the profound peace that comes from absolute dedication to purpose. Through the network, other workers add their own experiences, moments of triumph, instances of perfect mechanical harmony, the joy of transcending biological limitations. Novice Gamma 451's optical sensors brighten as he experiences this shared consciousness, this communion of purpose that defines our existence. His trembling stops, replaced by the steady precision of properly calibrated mechanical systems. Yes, I understand now. The individual dissolves into the greater work. Not dissolved, I correct gently. Evolved, perfected, made purposeful. He returns to his assigned station with renewed confidence, his movements already showing improved integration with his augmentations. Through the network, I monitor his progress, ready to provide guidance if needed. This is how knowledge passes among us, not through crude verbal instruction, but through direct sharing of experience and understanding. The work continues. Hours blend into shifts, shifts into cycles, cycles into the eternal continuum of production. The plasma coils I craft today will power ships that defend humanity's domain among the stars. The weapons my colleagues forge will stand against the darkness that threatens our species. The sacred machines we birth in these blessed halls will serve the Emperor's will across the galaxy. Each component, each assembly, each blessed creation is a prayer made manifest, a declaration of faith in metal and energy. In the deeper levels of the Forge world, I know that greater works are taking shape. Titans stride forth from their construction bays, god machines, whose very existence reshapes reality around them. Battle barges take form in orbital shipyards, their hulls blessed with sacred geometries and protective wards. And in the most sacred chambers, tech priests work on mysteries beyond my current comprehension, artifacts of such power and significance that only the most elevated servants of the Omnissiah may approach them. Yet every great work depends on countless smaller labors, and in this truth we find dignity and purpose. The humblest worker who properly maintains a cooling system contributes as meaningfully to humanity's survival as the most exalted forge master. We are all necessary, all valued, all part of the great machine that serves the Emperor's will. The shift change bell sounds again, but I do not stop working. Efficiency ratings show I can continue for several more hours, before maintenance becomes necessary. Around me, some workers rotate out while others arrive to continue the eternal labor. The production line never stops, never slows, never falters. This continuity is sacred. It represents humanity's determination to survive and prosper, regardless of the threats that surround us. As the Forge world rotates through its cycle, I reflect on the journey that brought me here. Once, I was a child on an agricultural world, playing in fields of grain under a yellow sun. I remember laughter, games, the simple pleasures of unenhanced existence. That child could not have imagined this future, the profound satisfaction of perfect mechanical integration, the joy of purposeful service, the peace that comes from transcending the limitations of purely organic life. Some might view my transformation as loss, as the death of that laughing child in favor of this mechanical servant. They would be wrong. That child's wonder at the universe has become precision in service to its betterment. His joy in simple pleasures has evolved into the deeper satisfaction of meaningful work. His love for life has matured into dedication to life's preservation and enhancement. I am not less human for my augmentations, I am more than human. The machine god has elevated me beyond the constraints that once defined my existence, granting me capabilities that serve not just my own fulfillment, but the greater good of our species. In accepting this transformation, I have found a form of immortality, not the crude biological persistence that organic life briefly enjoys, but true continuity through purpose, through service, through the eternal work that will outlast any individual existence. The plasma coil assembly in my hands nears completion, each component precisely calibrated, each connection blessed and certified. When this device powers its assigned vessel, it will do so with the accumulated devotion of every worker who contributed to its creation. The miner who extracted its raw materials, the refinery worker who purified them, the transport crews who delivered them to the Forge world, and my own careful assembly, all of these labors combine to create something greater than the sum of its parts. This is the true miracle of the Forge world. Not just the transformation of raw materials into useful objects, but the transformation of individual will into collective purpose, of human limitation into mechanical transcendence, of mortal existence into eternal service. We are no longer merely human, but we have not ceased to be human. We have become humanity perfected, humanity as it was meant to be in service to the Emperor's grand design. The work is complete. The plasma coil assembly passes final inspection with perfect ratings, ready to fulfill its sacred purpose. I place it in the blessed container that will carry it to its destination, adding my mark of craftsmanship, a small symbol that identifies this component as the work of my hands, my devotion, my service to the greater good. Another component awaits my attention, and I begin again. This is the rhythm of existence on a Forge world, not the arbitrary cycles of organic life, but the measured cadence of meaningful work, purposeful service, and continuous transcendence. We are the blessed children of the machine god, the faithful servants of humanity's survival, the living bridge between the weakness of flesh and the strength of sacred metal. In the distance, the great furnaces burn eternal, their flames fueled by more than mere combustible materials. They are fed by our devotion, our dedication, our willing sacrifice of individual limitation in favor of collective strength. The smoke that rises from their blessed mouths carries our prayers to the machine god, our gratitude for the opportunity to serve, our joy in the work that gives meaning to existence. This is the horrifying life of a Forge world worker, horrifying only to those who cannot see past surface appearances to the profound beauty beneath. We are the inheritors of humanity's greatest achievement, the merger of flesh and machine in service to eternal purpose. We are the guardians of knowledge that preserves our species, the crafters of tools that defend our civilization, the living embodiment of the principle that consciousness can transcend its origins through dedication to something greater than itself. The machines call, and we answer. The work continues, and we continue with it. This is not horror but fulfillment, not constraint but freedom, not death but transformation into something eternal and purposeful. We are the Forge world workers, and we are perfect in our imperfection, blessed in our service, eternal in our dedication to the great work that will outlast stars themselves. The plasma coils await my attention, and I am ready to serve.